All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. We are. I want to begin first by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Dina Bas Pesach, Zechariah Ben Zechariah. To thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Ephraim and Shifra Abramson, as a zuchus for Refuah Shalema for Moshe Shalom Ben Chana Bracha. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas Lav and Aliyah, the families, right, the families in Chama, as well as those who need a refuah, should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Well, so with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Tzadik Vav 96, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Tzadik Hamid Beis 95b. We're picking up about at Rabbi Eliezer Omer, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, about 15 lines up from the bottom. Supposed to just reorient ourselves a little bit. So if you remember again, we saw in the Mishnah a very fascinating idea. So the Mishnah spoke about the idea that even if you have a Karban Pesach that was brought B'tumah, halacha l'maisa, that doesn't necessarily allow all individuals who are tamei to go ahead and partake of that particular Karban Pesach. For example, we saw that a Karban Pesach that is brought B'tumah, because remember, that means 51% of Klal Yisrael are tameim, Tumas Meis. So the Mishnah said, Zovin, Zovos, Nidos, Yoldos cannot participate in that particular carbon. What the Gemara now is trying to figure out is, okay, I understand they can't participate in it, but as the Mishnah said, if they end up eating it, for example, there's no liability. So what you begin to see is that halacha l'maisa, whereas Tumah will not necessarily allow for an across-the-board consumption, we do see that once the Karban Pesach is being brought B'tumah, certain basic Tumah standards are relaxed. So the Gemara is trying to figure out just the balance between those two things. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yochel doch Zavin v'nichnesu la'azar b'Pesach haba B'tumah. Yochel yuchayav. And you might have thought that if Zavin pushed their way into the Azara, so let's say again, remember, individuals who are Zavin, they're not supposed to come into the Azar, into the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. They go ahead and push their way in. You might have thought that they should be chayiv. Says the Gemara, Talmud Lomar, v'yishalchu min ha'machana kol tzara v'chol zav. The pasuk says, you shall send away from the camp any tzarua and any zav. V'chol tamei lanefesh, and anyone who is tamei. So the Gemara says, Bisman shetmei mesim mishtalchin, when tmei mesim are sent away from the camp, Zavin and Mitzrayim mishtalchin, then Zavin and Mitzrayim are sent away as well. Ein tmei mesim mishtalchin, but if tmei mesim are not sent away, ein Zavin and Mitzrayim mishtalchin, then a Zavin Mitzrayim are not sent away. So again, we're going to begin to see a number of these type of tumah relationships. So a number of these different types of circumstances where, although we're going to see that halacha l'maisa, the only people who could eat a Karban Pesach that is brought b'tumah are those who are tamei tumas meis. Although again, even that statement is not totally true. We spoke about tumas sheretz before. Clearly, the Mishnah is indicating to me that halacha l'maisa, zavin, zavos, nidos, yoldos are not allowed to partake. Yet, the laws of tumah are clearly being relaxed. By Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef has an interesting shaila. Listen to this. We'll say, what happens if, here's the situation. Karban Pesach is being brought to Tumah. 51% of Klal Yisrael are Tamei Tumas Meis, which means they could go ahead and come into the Beis HaMikdash, they come into the Azara, do Karban Pesach. What happens if the Tamei Meisim got a little bit aggressive and pushed their way into the Heichal? So remember again, the Heichal is what we call the primary building of the Mikdash. That is the building in which you have the menorah, the Mizbeach HaZahav, the Shulchan, what we call the Kodesh, and then the curtain, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So what happens if the Tmei Mesim went ahead and got a little aggressive and pushed their way into the Heichal? Is there liability now? It's fascinating, Shaila. Is there liability for entering into the Heichal in a state of Tumah? So the Gemara says, do we say that once they're allowed into the Azara, which means the laws of Tumah have been suspended, they're allowed into the Heichal as well? My lo ishtari. Or we say no. What's permitted is permitted. What's not permitted is not permitted. As I'll say, there's a lot of profundity in that statement as well, which is how far sometimes one takes certain permissions. Right? Sometimes you have to be makel on something, right? We see this fascinatingly even over the pandemic. We see that from, there were especially, now thinking back, this has been going on for a year. But you think about, again, as we went through the Yom Tovim last year, Purim, Pesach, so there were certain things that we had to be makel on, certain things that by definition, circumstances necessitated kulos. It's always interesting in the dynamic of life leniencies. So kind of, do we say, heicha de ishtari, certain things are mutter for certain circumstances, but that does not create an ongoing, or do you say, heicha de ishtari, or do you say, mai de ishtari, or do you say, mid de ishtari. So it's almost as if once something is mutter, does everything become mutter? Or no, sometimes, again, certain things have to be mutter for certain circumstances at certain times, but lav dafka, that's an ongoing thing. It's an interesting shaila in halacha, interesting shaila in life. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Amar Kra, v'yishachal min ha'machana, afilu miktsas machana. So Rava says, the pasuk says, they shall send away the tmeim from the machana. So from the machana means even part of the machana. Ikadam, which could mean that halacha l'maisa, even if tumah is permitted, and therefore, for example, tamei mesim are permitted in the azara, that doesn't automatically give them a license to be in the heichel. Ikadamri, an alternate version, Amar Rava Amar Krabi Shachal min Amachana Al Michutz LaMachana Teshalachum. The pasuk says, "You shall send away the tameim from the camp to outside of the camp. You shall send them." This is very interesting. Kol heichad de karinan bei al michutz LaMachana Teshalchum karinan bei v'yishachal min Amachana. It is only when you send tameim out of the camp that ultimately, again, that halacha l'maisa, the din of el michutz lamachane applies. So we'll say a very interesting yisod, that according to this alternate version, it's only when some of the tameim are sent el michutz lamachane that you go ahead and apply the concept to the yishalchu min hamachane. So according to the second approach, once no one's being sent out of the camp, i.e. because the halachos of tumah have been fundamentally lifted, therefore, again, interestingly enough, there will be no prohibition associated with anyone tameh coming into any part of the Beis HaMikdash. So we'll say, it seems to be this is the conclusion of the Gemara, which is really quite interesting, that were you to have a circumstance where halacha l'maisa, again, tumah was hutra b'tzibor, so the tzibor is offering up the carbon in a state of tumah, even though, again, the license for tumah really only applies for those who are tamei meis, you begin to see across the board kulas by all forms of tumah, even in terms of entry into the Beis HaMikdash. Quite dramatic. Last line, Tzadik Hamid Beis. By Rav Yosef, Dachku Tmei, this is a great case. Let's say again, Dachku Tmei Meisim v'achle more Pesach haba b'tumah. Shabbos said, listen to this. What happens if the Tmei Meisim, you have a current Pesach that's being offered up in a state of tumah, the Tmei Meisim are getting a little bit rowdy. So what do? Not only do they push their way in, but they ate sacrificial parts. Imurim. They ate sacrificial parts that would normally be offered up on the Mizbeach. What's the halacha? Top of Tzadik Vav. Mahu. Midi ishtri tumas basar ishtri nami tumas imurin. So do we say that once halacha l'maisa, the tumas basar was removed, that tumas imurin is removed as well? O dilma my di ishtri, my di lo ishtri. Or no, maybe the concept of a carbon being offered up in tumah is dafka situation for the basar. It's not a din in the emurin. So amarava michdi. Let's analyze this. Tumas emurin meheches rabbi. From where do we learn tumas emurin? Mitumas basar. Dichsiv. Asher lahashem lerabos es haemurin. Kol hecha di isi letumas basar isi letumas emurin. Whenever there is a din of tumas basar, there is a din of tumas in the sacrificial parts. Kol hecha de leise letumas basar, leise letumas emurin. But bepashtus, wherever there is no tumas basar, there's no tumas emurin as well. Okay, so by Rabbi Zera, emure pesach mitzrayim hecha aktirna bose. Now this is just fascinating. Again, these gemaras are really just fascinating. So Rabbi Zera asks, by the way, now that you spoke about the sacrificial parts, where did they burn the sacrificial parts of the Karban Pesach? Pesach Mitzrayim, right? The first Karban Pesach, I will say. So where did they burn the sacrificial parts? In other words, remember again, sacrificial parts are normally burned where? Mizbeach. There was no Mizbeach in Mitzrayim. Pesach Mitzrayim. So where did they take care of the sacrificial parts in Pesach Mitzrayim? Armavei Abaye. Man leimalon, delo sheviski avud. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi says over sheviski is basar tzli b'shipur. So interestingly enough, so Rabbi says maybe there were no sacrificial parts in Mitzrayim, and they ate everything. Sheviski means like they made it into like a dish, like a roast. So maybe they just ate everything. In other words, Mehechatei saying that there was a din of a murid in Pesach Mitzrayim. Bepashtos, they ate everything. Vod, Hatan Rav Yosef, Gimel Mizbechos Hayusham. In fact, I will say this is quite beautiful. The Gemara says that there were 3 Mizbechos in Mitzrayim. What were the 3 Mizbechos, the 3 altars? Ala Mashkov Va'al Shtei HaMezuzos. The 3 altars were, right, the doorway, the top post and the 2 side posts. Ultimately, again, those were the 3 mizbechos. Now, also remember, again, what was applied to those areas was the blood, the sacrificial blood. So interestingly enough, if you want to get technical, it almost sounds like Pesach Mitzrayim had zrika, so to speak, right? The zrika was done onto the altar of Egypt, and the altar of Egypt was your doorway. But interestingly enough, there were no sacrificial parts. There are no sacrificial parts. But Pashtos, it sounds like the entire Karban by Pesach Mitzrayim was consumed. Quite fascinating. So I will say, now, interestingly enough, we continue to speak about, once the Gemara introduced this concept of Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Doros, another Mishnah that deals with this distinction. So Ma bein Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros. So we'll say, what is the distinction between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros? First Pesach, what we call Pesach Mitzrayim, the first Pesach, Pesach Doros, the Pesach for future generations. So a couple of distinctions. Number 1, Pesach Mitzrayim mikcho ba'asar, v'taun hazah ba'agudas ezov, v'al hamashkov v'al shtei hamazuzos. So we'll say, distinction number 1, Pesach Mitzrayim was purchased or was taken and brought into your home on the 10th of Nisan. The 10th of Nisan. We call this the concept of bikur. Bikur means the korban was examined to make sure that it was free from blemish 4 days before its offering. That's a din in Pesach Mitzrayim, is not a din in Pesach Doros. Next, number 2, Pesach Mitzrayim, the blood had to be applied on the doorways and on the top post. Ultimately, again, with Agudas Ezov, a bundle of hyssop. So blood application with a bundle of hyssop, din in Pesach Mitzrayim, not a din in Pesach Doros. Next, V'nechal b'chipazon, and ultimately, again, Pesach Mitzrayim was eaten with haste. Chipazon, that didn't apply to Pesach Doros. Balayla echad, in one night. We'll have to discuss what exactly that means, because Bepashtos Pesach Doros is also consumed in one night. But we'll see. Balayla achos, uPesach Doros nohi kol shema. Whereas ultimately, again, Pesach Doros applies all 7 days. So we'll say, so fascinating list of distinctions. Again, we'll have to define what that last one means, because it can't mean that literally Pesach, current Pesach for future generations is offered up 7 days, because that's not true. We'll see in the Gemara what it means. So I will say, but bottom line distinctions are Pesach Mitzrayim bought on the 10th doesn't apply Pesach Doros. Pesach Mitzrayim blood applications on the side post, the top post doesn't with a bundle of hyssop doesn't apply for Pesach Doros. Pesach Mitzrayim chipazon eaten in haste doesn't apply to Pesach Doros. And lastly, again, the one we don't really understand is Pesach Mitzrayim. The Gemara says, Mishnah says, is eaten for 1 night versus Pesach Doros for 7. We'll have to define that last one. Says the Gemara, Minalan, from where do we know this? From where do we know? We'll say, addressing the first one, from where do we know that by Pesach Mitzrayim, the korban was taken on the 10th? So the Gemara says, well, the pasuk says, Dichsev, Dabro kol adas Yisrael lemor be'asor lachodesh hazeh v'yikchu. Pasuk says, on the 10th of the month, they will purchase their korban Pesach. So I'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara darshans, Zeh mikcho ba'asar ve'in Pesach Doros mikcho ba'asar. We learn from this pasuk that it's dafka Zeh. It's dafka this Pesach, i.e., Pesach Mitzrayim that is purchased on the 10th, but in future generations, it does not work this way. I will say, remember again, just to give you the illustration, we saw this, we've seen this in other Masechtas, this idea that, remember, again, a lot of times, not a lot, they used to sell sacrificial animals in the Beis HaMikdash, right? Which makes a lot of sense, because if you're traveling from out of town, you don't want to go ahead and have to schlep livestock with you. So they would sell animals, right? There was the Lishkas Hatloim. They would go ahead and sell animals in the Beis HaMikdash. So Bepashtos, the Gemara, so therefore I'm sure you had plenty, I would think that you had plenty of people who were showing up on Erev Pesach, purchasing an animal in the marketplaces of Yerushalayim or in the Beis HaMikdash itself. But halacha l'maisa, so therefore this din of mikcho ba'asar, the Gemara Darshans, was dafka Pesach Mitzrayim, not Pesach Doros. So the Gemara says, ve'im Pesach Doros, mikcho ba'asar. It was only first Pesach, we call Pesach Mitzrayim, that you bought it on the 10th, but not Pesach Doros. Ela me'ata. But using this logic, v'haya lachel l'mishmeres ad arba asar yom l'chodesh hazeh. So Rabbi said, the pasuk says, and you shall guard the carbon, so it shall be for you for a guarding, up until the 14th of this month, which again, pasuk is referring to Pesach Mitzrayim. You would watch the carbon for 4 days. Hachanami zeh ta'un bikar daled yom koden shchita ve'in acher ta'un bikar. So we'll see. Again, I would be first wide line tzadik vav amud. I would be tempted. How do I interpret this pasuk? They both say the din of bikur. The din of bikur means keeping an animal under your personal surveillance to make sure that it does not become blemished. So based on the way you dash in the pasuk, I would say the din of bikur only applies to Pesach Mitzrayim, doesn't apply to future generations. But is that true? Vatanya ben Bagbag Omer minayin letamid shetaun bikur dalidam kodem shchita. Wow. How do I know about say that the carbon tamid actually requires bikur? A carbon tamid must be kept under watch to ensure that it is free from blemish 4 days before that it's offered. Shene'emar tishmeru la'akriv liba moado ulahalanu omer v'haya lachem mishmeres ad 14 ma lahalan ta'un bikur dalad yom kodem shchita afkan tar bikur dalad yomim kodem shchita. So we'll say this is incredible. The Gemara makes a gzer shava between Tamid and Pesach Mitzrayim. To say just like Pesach Mitzrayim required Bikur 4 days before the carbon was offered up, so to a carbon Tamid requires Bikur 4 days before it's offered up. So I will say, so we do see that we learn out from Pesach Mitzrayim contemporary obligation for Bikur. Now, albeit this is being learned out for Tamid, but if it applies to Tamid, can't one make a cogent argument that halacha l'mais again it should apply for Pesach Doros as well? To which the Gemara says no. Shiny hasam tichsiv tishmeru. So we'll say no. It's a little bit different because, like we said, it's Gzer Shava. It uses the same lashon by Pesach Mitzrayim as it does by Carbon Tamid. So you can make a Gzer Shava to say just like Pesach Mitzrayim required Bikur, so too Tamid required Bikur or requires Bikur. Upesach Doros nami kaksiv va'avarta es ha'avoda hazos b'chodesh hazeh shiyu kol avodos chodesh zeh kazeh. But I kedarshin at Pesach Doros. What does the pasuk say? You shall perform this avoda in this month, and I kedarshin that all of the avodos done during this month should resemble the original avoda. In other words, I can make a cogent argument that Pesach Mitzrayim should really mimic Pesach Doros, if in not every way, at least when it comes to how you deal with the carbon, and therefore Pesach Doros should require Bikur as well. To which the Gemara says, Hazeh lemeute Pesach Sheni dekavase. Ultimately, again, Hazeh is coming to exclude Pesach Sheni. Elameata, but if that's the case, Elameata dichsiv va'achles habasra balayla Hazeh. The pasuk says you shall eat the meat on this night. Hachanami tizeh ne'echal balayla ve'in acher ne'echal balayla. So what are you going to dash? We'll say that it's only Pesach Mitzrayim where the carbon is consumed at night, but in future generations it's not consumed at night. Amrikra, va'avarata es ha'avoda. Therefore, the pasuk says, you shall perform this avodah. So we'll say, we're going to see this over and over, that interestingly enough, this phrase, va'avarata es ha'avoda, is the phrase that the Gemara uses to create what we'll call carbonic consistency, to tell us that details which are really inherent to the actual preparation and consumption of the carbon, those details remain for all future generations as well. Secondary details like bikur or like blood applications on the mashkaf and on the mezuzos, those will not apply. So that's va'avodat havoda. Ela hazeh lamali. So what do I do with the word hazeh? The chid Rabbi Elazar ben Azai Rabbi Akiva. So also again we'll discuss Rabbi Elazar ben Azai Rabbi Akiva. They discuss ultimately again there's machlokes about the timing for consumption of carbon Pesach. Can carbon Pesach be eaten until the morning, or could it be consumed only until Chatzos? According to the opinion who holds that it's until Chatzos, where does he get that from? He gets it from the word Hazeh. It says Hazeh by carbon Pesach, and it says Hazeh by Makas Bechoros. When did Makas Bechoros happen? When? What time? Chatzos. Chatzos. So just like Hazeh by Makas Bechoros means midnight, so to Hazeh, according to at least one opinion, by Karban Pesach means until midnight. Okay. So I will say, when the pasuk says by Pesach Mitzrayim that a Orel, someone who's uncircumcised, is not allowed to eat it. Hachanami. So I can make the argument, Debo eino ochel, aval ochel b'Pesach Toros. So we'll say maybe the halach is like this. Maybe only an Orel is not allowed to eat Pesach Mitzrayim. Maybe Arelos is a din of Pesach Mitzrayim. But by Pesach Doros, an Orel can eat. Amrikra va'avarata. So we'll say you begin to see the same thing over and over. It says va'avarata as avoda. You perform the avoda. Namely, the avoda of carbon Pesach is the same throughout. It's the same on Pesach Mitzrayim, the same on Pesach Doros. Ela bo lamali. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, then why do I need bo? Because we'll say, here's what throws us off. When the Torah speaks about the original Pesach, it says, v'chol oral lo yochal bo. So it could. So if it would have just said "B'chol Orel Lo Yochal," I would say, okay, the Torah is giving me a din in Hilchos Carbon Pesach in general. Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Doros. When you say "B'chol Orel Lo Yochal" Bo, Rabbi say seems to indicate what? Bo you could be understood as Pesach Mitzrayim, but yet we say "Va'avaratas Havoda Hazos." The avoda for Pesach always remains the same. Fine. So therefore, an Orel can't eat Pesach Mitzrayim. It can't eat Pesach Doros. So why do I need the word bo? What does that come to add? Here we go. Bo eino ochel, aval hu ochel b'matzah u'morer. Both is very interesting. It is true, the Orel cannot eat of carbon Pesach, but the Orel can eat of matzah and morer. Interesting. Elameata kol ben nechar lo yochal bo. Hachanami de bo eino ochel, aval ochel hu Pesach ledoros. So we'll say, so maybe I could say when it is called ben nechar lechor. So we'll say, so remember again, ben nechar. If you look at Rashi, is actually an interesting phrase. Ben nechar, Rashi says, is a meshumad, an apikoris, a Jew. So a Jew, ultimately again, who just simply, what's the best way, a Jew who actively renounces his Yiddishkeit. So a Meshumar who goes against Torah, goes against mitzvahs. Shenisnachlu ma'asav la'av v'shashar. So also remember again, to be very clear, a ben nechar is not a person who might not be observant, who might not be. This is talking about someone who's antagonistic, right? Religiously antagonistic. So someone who actively goes against the mitzvos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a desire to go ahead and rebel. So the Gemara says, Kol ben nechar lo yochal bo. So same issue. Pasuk says, a ben nechar can't go ahead and eat carbon Pesach. Hachanami, de bo eino ochal, aval ochel Pesach l'doro. So we'll say, so once again, it's that bo that throws us a little bit. So I look at that pasuk and I say to myself, maybe a ben nechar, a meshuma, did not be kores. He can't eat carbon Pesach. He can't eat Pesach Mitzrayim. But maybe you can eat Pesach Doros. We'll say, by the way, it's interesting, right? You think about this for just a moment. He's an apikores. So why is he showing up to eat Karban Pesach? Why is this even a kasha? So there's a couple of answers. Simple answer is, everybody likes a good meal, right? That's okay. Let's say, but on a much more profound level, even the apikores shows up at some time. Rabbi Soloveitchik says very beautifully, he says, the word tshuva is, of course, as you know, from the lashon of lashuv, from the lashon of to return. He says, Rabbi Soloveitchik writes, life is a circle. Life is a circle. The only variable is the circumference or the diameter of that circle. Rabbi Soloveitchik says sometimes the circle has a radius anaki, sometimes it has a large radius, sometimes a small radius. Everyone comes back. Everyone comes back. Some people come back with a desire to come back. Some people can't admit that they want to come back, but for some reason the Meshumad shows up at the Karban Pesach. I say the idea being never give up on anyone. Never give up on any person. Because even the Ben Nechar, even the Meshumad, you'll be surprised when he walks through the door for the Karban Pesach. Because sometimes even when people put on a particular show, they want to look like they reject or they resent deep down. The neshama truly desires and the neshama truly wants. Everyone comes back to the Ribono Shel Olam. It's just a question of how, just a question of when. Pretty incredible. So we'll say that I might have thought that therefore it says Kol Ben Nechar Lo Yochal Bo. I might have thought that this din only applies to Pesach Mitzrayim, not to Pesach Doros. Amar Kra Va'avarata. Therefore the pasuk will say again, we keep coming back to the same phrase. Va'avarata, the avoda for Pesach Doros will be the same as Pesach Mitzrayim. Ela bo lamali. So why does it say bo? In other words, again, it gets that same question. Because also when you say Kol B'neicha Lo Yochal Bo, remember, the topic that's being discussed over here is Pesach Mitzrayim. So if you don't mean to limit the Ben Nechar's ineligibility to Pesach Mitzrayim, so then why say the word Bo? The Gemara says, Bo Hamaras Das Poselas, Vein Hamaras Das Poselas. Bitruma. So also this is very interesting. It's only, being a Meshumad, only precludes you from eating Karban Pesach. It doesn't preclude you from eating Truma. So for example, if you have a Kohen who's an Apikoris or a Kohen who's a Meshumad, halacha l'maaseh he can eat Truma. Right? Very interesting. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, Ve'itzrich l'michtav aral, ve'itzrich l'michtav ben nechar. So also this is actually very interesting now. Why do you have to write both aral and ben nechar? Right? An aral is someone who's uncircumcised. Ben Nechar is someone who is a Meshumad. So the Gemara says, why do I have to write both? I'll tell you why. Dikas of Rachmana Arel Mishum Demais. If the Torah would have excluded an Arel from Karban Pesach, I would have said, literally an Arel, Ma'is also means disgusting. Which means is, there's something about the Arel which is physically repulsive. Right? From a Judaic perspective. There's something about him that is physically repulsive. That's why he's not allowed to go ahead and be part of the Karban Pesach. Aval Ben Nechar lo ma'is. Both say this is wild, no? The Ben Nechar is not ma'is. Like the Ben Nechar, the Meshumad, is not ma'is. So we'll say, isn't this fascinating? Isn't this fascinating? So we'll say, what's the pshat over here? So the pshat is, of course, when someone has a bris milah, there is a covenant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that is emblazoned on their body. It's emblazoned on their body. So what once you have that, by definition, whatever your hashkafas or beliefs are, lemaisa, again, you're within the covenant of the Ribono Shel Olam. But ultimately, again, and therefore, if you don't have that covenant, there's a certain type of mius that's there. Masha'in kain, when a person is a meshumad, amazingly enough, although again they're hashkafas, and it's not just their hashkafas, like their entire mindset is so spiritually repugnant, yet from a halachic perspective, they are Judaically intact, which both say is such an incredible yesod. That, okay, we have to go through this. It's so fascinating because the Gemara is looking at two people who are removed from the fold. One removed from the fold physically because of a physical difference, and one removed from the fold because of an ideological difference. And it's so fascinating to see the importance. Remember, again, this goes back to the Gemara. You know, the Gemara, I think it was in Shabbos or Brachas, where David HaMelech was in the bathhouse, and he was very distressed because he felt that he had no mitzvahs. But then he saw that he had bris milah. His milah was with him, so to speak. So he had bris milah, and this comforted him. That's the power of bris. In other words, it's a covenantal sign and a mitzvah that is with me no matter what. I could divest myself of all other mitzvahs except for bris. All right, so the Gemara says, therefore, v'yashvina benechar, mishun dein libo l'shamayim. Both say, now the Gemara advances the exact opposite argument. If it would have excluded benechar, I would have said, okay, benechar is excluded. Why? Ein libo l'shamayim. His heart is not with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Aval orel de libo l'shamayim emolo. But an orel whose heart is with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he just has a physical issue, then ultimately, again, maybe he shouldn't be excluded, therefore tzricha. So therefore we'll say the Torah has to state both Arel and Benechar can't participate. Alamiata, Toshav v'sacher lo yochal bo, hachenami debohu eno ochel, aval ochel hu b'pesach Torah. So we'll say when the Torah excludes a Toshav and a Sachir, so the Gemara says, once again, I would have thought it's only in Pesach Doros that they, only Pesach Pesachim they can't participate. Pesach Doros they can. The Gemara says, Amerkra va'avarata, same phrase avarata, ela bo lamali, bo hamaras das poseles, ve'ein hamaras das poseles b'shuma. So I just want to point out, Rashi actually removes this entire section from the Gemara. This is because it doesn't read right. The Gemara answers Hamaras Das, which is Apikarsis. Apikarsis has nothing to do with Toshav and Sakir. So Rashi actually removes this section. So we'll go weiter. Elameata, Umalta also as Yochabo. The pasuk says, you shall circumcise your Eved, and then he could eat in it. So we'll say, now I want to point out to you what that means is, if you have uncircumcised Avodim, they also preclude you from participating in Korban Pesach. So the Gemara says, so once again, I would have thought this only applies to Pesach, not to Pesach Doros. Amrikra, va'avarata, we'll say same Gemara, va'avarata, elabo lamali. So why do I need the phrase bo? So the Gemara says, bo milas zechara va'avadav ma'keves, ve'milas zechara va'avadav ma'keves b'truma. Well, it's teaching a very interesting halacha, that having uncircumcised slaves only prevents me from participating in Pesach. But for example, if I'm a Kohen, it would not preclude me or prevent me from eating Truma. The pasuk says, by Pesach Mitzrayim you can't break a bone. Once again, I will say, it's the same Gemara. It's over and over. Bo. That's what this is. So bo seems to be such a limiting phrase. So etzam lo yishperu bo. You can't break bones in the Pesach. When? Pesach Mitzrayim. But Pashtos not by Pesach Doros. Amrakra va'avarata. Therefore we'll say the pasuk is va'avarata. The avoda of this month of Pesach must be the same throughout all of the generations. So the Gemara says, Ela bo lamali. But why do I need bo? Bo bebasar velo bepasal. Bekasha velo bepasal. Then I will say the din of shviras etzem only applies in a Korban Pesach that is kosher, not in a Pesach that is pasal. Ela me'ata dechsev. Al tochlu mimenu na. So we'll say the pasuk says you shall not eat of it raw. Mimenu iata ochel, ava'ata ochel na bePesach Torah. So once again, you would have said you only can't eat of Pesach Mitzrayim when it's raw, but maybe Pesach Doros I can. Amekra va'avarita. There we'll say the pasuk says va'avarita ella mimenu lamali. So why do I need the word mimenu, which seems to be limiting? L'chidraba am Rabbi Yitzchak. But we'll say ultimately again, like Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, namely the halacha l'maiser. Rashi said over here, Paraka oral ne'amar imenu b'Pesach ne'amar b'maiser ma'lalon oral asur Pesach afkar. So Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak that it teaches me that it's used for Gzera Shava between Pesach and Maiser, and to teach me that the same way that an oral can't eat of Pesach, an oral also can't eat of Maiser. So we'll say what comes out is that halacha l'maisa. Although it's interesting that the Torah goes ahead and phrases a lot of the halachos of Korban Pesach by Pesach Mitzrayim and attaches limiting words to those halachos. Bo, mimenu, the phrase of va'avarata es ha'avoda hazos miyamim yamima, va'avarata es ha'avoda hazos, you will do this avoda, says the avoda of Pesach Mitzrayim becomes the ongoing avoda for Pesach throughout all of the generations, with the exceptions as listed in the Mishnah. Good. Let's go weiter. Pesach Doros no ikol shiva. So also remember again, the last cryptic statement in the Mishnah was that whereas Pesach Mitzrayim only applies for one night, Pesach Doros applies, Pesach for Pesach Doros applies all 7 days. The Gemara says, Amai kai, What are you talking? In other words, what is that referring to? Ilema Pesach Chol Shiva Mi'ika. Rabbi say, is the Mishnah saying that Karban Pesach for Pesach Doros applies all 7 days? That obviously cannot be the case. Amud Beis Ella Achametz. Rather, refers to Rabbi is the Isra of Chametz. Isra of Chametz. That whereas that sounds like what it's saying is Pesach Mitzrayim, maybe Chametz only applied at the time the carbon was being offered, but by Pesach Doros, the Isra Chametz applies all 7 days. Verses 1 second, Michlal, the Pesach Mitzrayim Laila Echad B'Sulo. Are you coming to tell me that by Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isra Chametz only applied for one night and that's all? The Gemara says, V'atanya, Rabbi Yosef Lili Omer Minayin La Pesach Mitzrayim Shein Chimutzo Noig Elo Yom Echad Talmud Loma Lo Yochal Chametz. So first of all, even if you hold that the Isra Chametz of Pesach Mitzrayim did not span the entire 7 days, it lasted for at least what? One complete day. One complete day, which means that the Isra wasn't just for the night of Pesach, it was at least one complete day. So what does the Mishnah mean? Elachi Kamar, Laila Echad, V'adin Pesach Doros, V'chimutzo kol hayom, u'pesach doros nohei kol shiva. Rather, I will say what it means is as follows, that the distinction the Mishnah is making is, when it comes to the Isra Chametz, this is actually very interesting. So for Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isra Chametz lasted only 1 day, but one full day. So the night, when the Pesach started, throughout that first day of Yom Tiv, but by Pesach Doros, the Isra Chametz lasts for the 6 following days, for the full 7 days. So therefore, what comes out of the Mishnah is Halacha L'Maisa. The distinctions between Karban Pesach or Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Doros is number 1, Pesach Mitzrayim Mikcho Ba'asar. You bought it on the 10th, 4 days beaker, right? That does not apply by Pesach. That does not apply by Pesach Doros. Next, the sprinkling of the blood on the doorposts, right, and on the top post. Pesach Mitzrayim, not Pesach Doros. Next, also with a bundle of hyssop. Next, chipazon, which the Gemara really didn't discuss. Pesach Mitzrayim eaten with haste. Pesach Doros. Not the reason the Gemara doesn't discuss that is why I will say. Why? That's much more intuitive, right? Because remember again, why was Pesach Mitzrayim consumed b'chipazon? Because they had to go, right? They literally were going. So that's an understandable distinction. And lastly, again, is a din in chametz. Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isra Chametz lasted 1 day. Pesach Doros, 7 days. Beautiful. Let's go back to Rabbi Yeshua. We'll say, so now some really fascinating halachas with karbanos. Really fascinating. So Rabbi Yeshua. Shamati, I heard, shetmuras Pesach kreva, utemuras Pesach ena kreva. So I'll say, this is actually interesting. So I want to point out what's happening over here. We're talking now about temura. The word temura could be used in 2 different ways. There's classic temura. Everyone knows classic temura, right? It's classic temura, right? I have a carbon that is set aside for a shlamim, just for argument's sake. And I say, right, animal A. I say, you know what? I don't want to offer up animal, and I already designated it. I don't want to offer up A. Instead, I want to swap A for B. I'm going to offer up B. That's called temura, swapping. You're not allowed to do that. And if you do that, what happens if you engage in carbonic swapping? I'll say what happens? Vayahu usmura so kodesh. Both animals become consecrated. So there's like a penalty. Both animals come. So when it comes to Karban Pesach, temura also takes on a different idea, which is as follows: I separated an animal for Karban Pesach. Fantastic. But say then what happens? I lose the animal. It runs away. I misplace it. Whatever it is, I can't find it. So what do? I go ahead and I identify. Right? I purchase another animal. I will say, then what happens? I find the first. So now we'll say that's also called temura. Now, again, in that case, I didn't do anything wrong. In that case, I lost my original animal. I identified, right? I designated a replacement animal. But now the shaila comes up with, okay, so what happens with the 2 animals? So now, with that background, I'm going to show Shamati. Shetmuras Pesach kreva, temuras Pesach ina kreva. I heard that sometimes temuras Pesach is offered as a shlamim, and sometimes it's not. Ve'inli lefarish, but I don't know which is when. Right? I don't know what is what. I'm Rabbi Akiva ani efarish. Rabbi Akiva says, let me explain it to you. HaPesach shenim sakolim shchitas HaPesach. So we'll say, listen to this. If you lose we'll call it animal A. It's Karban Pesach. I designated animal A. I lost A. Therefore designated B. So Rabbi Akiva says like this. If you find A before you ended up offering B, so you have to allow A to graze, right? To graze until it develops a mum. Then you go ahead and sell it. And then you could go ahead and then use the money to purchase a shlamim. So similarly, the same thing would happen if you would actively try to swap out the animal. But if you find A after B has already been offered, karav shlamim. Ultimately, again, you could immediately offer up B as a shlamim, v'chein temuraso, and the same is true ultimately again for the temur. Now, both said, let's talk about this for just a moment because it's actually quite fascinating. Take a look at Rashi at Pesach. Sha'avad v'hifrish acher tachtov. So we'll say, so remember again, in the Mishnah's case, I have a korban Pesach, I lost it, right? I lost animal A, and I have a replacement Pesach now with B. So what happens? So there are two cases, I will say. In both cases, I'm finding B. What's the variable here? What's the variable? When you find B. Do you find B before you offered A or after you offered? I'm sorry, just the opposite. I find A, right? A is the one that's lost, right? A was my original animal, got lost, replaced it with B. Now I find A again. The shaila is, when I find A, before B was offered or after B was offered? So look at Rashi. Rashi says, so the first case is where I find A before I offered B. The haya ome lefaninu b'shas shchita, hare kavaso b'shas shchita b'shem Pesach. V'zeh shelo ekrivo dacheyu be'adayim lo yikarev od hu atzmo shlamim de'ein zeh mosar Pesach al Pesach. Listen to this. This is fascinating. So when A is found before B is offered, what do I have in front of me, Rabbi Hossein? I have two karbanos. So now when I end up offering up B, A can't be offered up as a shlamim. Why? Because A was actively designated as a Pesach, and it was around b'shas shchita. So because of that, I cannot go ahead and offer up A as a shlamim. Instead, what I have to do is what's called, it was nitche. It was nitche for being a shlamim. So I have to let it graze, develop a mum, sell it, use the money to purchase shlamim. We'll say mashe'en ke. Now you understand the second case. Where same thing, I have A, lose A, replace it with B, but now in this case, suppose I offer up B, so I've offered up my Korban Pesach, and I find A afterwards. When you find A after B has been offered, you could immediately offer up A as a shlamim. Because since A was not extant, since A was not there, at the time the Korban Pesach was being offered, its identity as a Pesach is not solidified and concretized, and therefore when you find it, you can offer it up as a shlamim. Let's see, you hear that distinction? So again, we're going to see it more in the Gemara, but that's my introduction. Says the Gemara, Valema Pesach Karav uPesach Eno Karav. So I'll say, this is actually interesting. Why do you have to say Pesach Kreva Utmuras Pesach Eno Kreva? Why don't you just say there's a case where the Pesach is offered and the Pesach is not offered? Says the Gemara, Hakamash Malan Diika Tmuras HaPesach Telo Karva. To teach you that there's a case of Tmuras Pesach. There is a case where you have a substitute Korban Pesach where it's not offered up. So says the Gemara, Itma Rabba Amar Kodem Shchita Ula Acher Shchita Shaninu. So we'll say, as the way I explained it to you before, everything depends. We'll say, right, what you do with A. Remember again, A was the original Karban that was lost and then recovered. How you deal with A. Namely, there are two possibilities. Whether you can immediately offer up A as a shlamim right now, or you have to let A graze, develop a mum, sell it, and then use the money to purchase a shlamim. That is fundamentally dependent on when you find A. If you found it before the shchita of B, or after the shchita of B. Rabbi Zera Amar, no. Kodim chatzos ula akar chatzos shani. Rabbi say this is fascinating. Rabbi Zera says no. It's fundamentally dependent on. Did you find it before chatzos of Erev Pesach or after chatzos on Erev Pesach? Because Rabbi say what that will depend. Therefore, is do you have another korban that is ready to be offered or not? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Zera hakatani kodem shchitas haPesach. I Rabbi Zera. The Mishnah says that what you do with A is fundamentally dependent on shchita. Ema kodem zman shchitas haPesach. Rabbi Zera will say the Mishnah meant to say zman shchitas haPesach. Kitanois, the Gemara says machlokes tanoim haPesach shenimtza kodem shchita. If a korban Pesach is found ultimately before shchita, yira then you go ahead and you set it out to graze. It's the same process. You go ahead and you let it graze, develop a mum, then use the money to purchase. The Acher Chatzos, Yikari. But if you go ahead and you find it after Chatzos, then Halacha Lamaisa, again, it can be offered up immediately. Those who have to stop over here, but just understand, this is really an incredibly riveting sugya. So we're going to see again that Halacha Lamaisa, what you do ultimately again with a carbon that is lost and found, whether you could offer it up immediately or whether halacha lamaisa, again you have to let it graze, is going to be fundamentally dependent on when you can find it. I will say we'll pick up here tomorrow. Just a reminder, Mir Hashem, tomorrow again Shir starts at 5:45 a.m. Davening in Meretz Hashem is at 6:30, and also we'll say there's a basket for Machzis HaShekel if anybody wants to know from the mitzvah right between Kalman Akiva and Menachem Shofel, right over here. Let's say Shekayach.